Hello viewers, and a warm welcome to Dinner Guide this evening. My name is Chef Andy, and today we're going to be working on something some of you may have bypassed at a supermarket and you may not exactly know what it was. We're going to be working with some soy chunks today, and I'm also going to be pairing that with a very simple mixed rice. But before I begin, I'll of course introduce the ingredients that we'll be working with, just to give you an idea of what to expect for the show. Now you will of course require some chili flakes, about a teaspoon. You'll also require a stock cube, about a tablespoon of some tomato paste, and a few of some coriander seeds. You'll also require some cumin powder, about a teaspoon, about another teaspoon of some dried parsley, some garlic cloves there, and a bit of some frozen peas. You'll also require about 4 carrots chopped up very roughly. You'll also require about half a cup of some uncooked basmati rice. You'll also require just 1 packet of some soy chunks, about 3 medium-sized onions, about 4 medium-sized tomatoes. You'll also require some chopped up green bell pepper, some fresh coriander leaves, some oil to cook with, and of course some water to aid you in cooking all this. And very importantly, also have some salt and pepper for seasoning. Now, before we begin, we'll of course give you this chance to sit back, relax, and unwind, and we'll see you after a short break. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. If you're just tuning in, we're right about ready to start the recipe for today. We're going to be making a very simple soy chunk stew. We're also going to be pairing that with some very simple vegetable rice. Now, very importantly, always begin with the easiest one first. So we're of course going to start off by steaming up some rice. So into a pan, proceed to pour in your basmati rice. And very importantly, always try and make sure that your consistency is much even. So use the same, of course, use the same cup to measure out about double the portion of water. So I'm going to begin by adding a single cup. I'll also add a second one. Right, simple as that. Now, very importantly, of course, before proceeding, very important to season with some salt. Right, now knowing that the peas are of course frozen, so remember these have already been cooked and they've just been allowed to sit in the refrigerator or in the freezer. We're of course going to need our carrots to be nice and soft through the process. So you can proceed to add about half of your chopped up carrots. Simple as that. And now all you need to do is turn this over. Of course, very important to place a lid, give it a bit of a mix. And all you need to do now is proceed to allow that to come to the boil. You can of course, if you wish at this stage, you can also drizzle in just a little bit of oil. This will of course aid in making sure that your rice granules do not stick together, and it will give a nice beautiful color and appearance to your rice as well. Now once that is done, we're also going to be doing our soy chunks. So into another pan, we'll begin by adding our soy chunks. And I'm also going to measure out just the same quantity of the chunks to water. Right, simple as that. Now all we need to do at this stage is begin by steaming this for about 5 minutes. So I'm going to begin by turning on the gas, and we're going to allow that to steam up for about 5 minutes. This should give it just a bit of time to absorb the liquid and puff up nice and easy. And then we're of course going to remove that, and we're going to begin to fry it, which will of course take us into the stewing process. But of course, as you have a bit of time while those continue to cook, this will of course aid you in preparing the rest of the ingredients. So I'm going to begin by chopping up some onion. So I'm using red onion for this recipe. Do feel free to incorporate other different varieties such as leeks and spring onions. They also give a nice beautiful fragrance. And all you need to do now is proceed to chop that as finely as possible, using of course the very simple method of chopping that I always like to recommend. Begin by first slicing over the top and once across, and this will of course give you a nice beautiful easy size that you can work with. And remember, you can of course add this to a food chopper. It will of course aid you in saving up quite a bit of time. And if you're of course having that bit of issue, maybe that bit of worry of chopping onions and having the crying effect, remember some very simple tips I always share. You can of course proceed to peel it and rinse it under some cold water, or you can even leave it in your refrigerator for about 5 minutes before chopping. This will of course make it much easier for you to chop up your onions while they're fresh. I'm just going to chop up the rest of my onion. Very importantly, making sure that you try and get your sizes nice and even. Remember, very importantly, to always get your consistency right. This will of course carry forward all the way to the plating stage. And of course, if you do have some of your onions that are not cleanly or fairly chopped, you will of course be able to pick them out very quickly. Right, so just to finish off that last half, simple as that. Now we are of course going to be chopping this up 2 ways. So I'm going to be chopping up one onion that we're going to be using for the stew, and I'm also going to chop up one other onion which we're going to be using to saute our peas just before we incorporate that into the rice. Right, so very simply proceed to chop up your second piece. And of course, always very important to share with you, using a sharp knife makes it so much easier, saves you the extra time, and of course guarantees a more consistent finish every single chop. And now for those of you who may of course be wondering, or if you just tuned in and you're not sure what we're doing on the show today, we're going to be working on some soy chunks. Now these you can be able to purchase locally in your retail supermarkets. They're very much cheap to afford as well. A very good substitute for those of you looking at some low cholesterol, vegetarian friendly meals. And I'm hoping by the end of the show I may actually be able to convince you to actually give them a try. Now one beautiful thing about them, they're packed with a lot of protein. They also give a nice beautiful fiber content to them. And another thing is it's a very good substitute to using meat. And it also goes very well with any particular vegetarian dishes. Now just to give that a quick check, as you'll be able to see, the chunks will actually puff up quite a little bit once they are fully steamed up. So this will of course at this stage proceed to, you can actually proceed now to drain the water. So just by of course giving, or rather covering your lid, or rather covering your pot, proceed to empty out the excess water. Simple as that. And now all we need to do now is begin the stewing process. But before I do so, we're of course going to finish up chopping that last half of our red onion. Now, as I mentioned, very important to have about 2 or 3 onions for this particular recipe. If you're going to be using 2 large onions or 3 medium-sized onions, Definitely, that is of course upon you if you do want to change the ratios. And just to finish that last bit of onion up, that should take you into the next process. But before we do so, I will of course give a bit of a break just to get the show on the go. Very important to also be able to time your meal nice and easily. So at this stage you may actually now check on your rice, give it a quick mix, and at the moment that your rice is almost halfway cooked, you can now proceed to add your peas. As I said, these were pretty much cooked a little earlier. We had a little bit saved up, or rather left over. So this is also a very, very nice particular way of incorporating some leftover steamed vegetables. Remember, you can actually steam your vegetables in advance, freeze them for maybe 2 to 3 days. And once you're ready to use them up, you can easily just allow them to defrost very, very easily and in some room temperature. And then you can of course incorporate this to your dish. So once your peas are in, proceed to give your rice a quick mix. And we're now going to allow that to continue to cook right up until the point where the rice is fully cooked. And this will of course give us a chance to begin the next part of the dish. But I will of course allow this to cool off, giving you also a chance to freshen up. And when we do come back, do stay tuned. We are going to begin the very simple process of making that very simple soy stew. And I'll also be giving you for today, which is a soy chunk stew and some mixed rice. Now we'll of course begin by taking out the rice that's already done. Remember, this we had allowed to steam up just before we went on a break. So I'm just going to move that onto a plate just to be able for you to see what it turned out like. And now something I also grew fond of when I was growing up, very much it became a very boring occurrence to have some plain rice, especially when you're trying to enjoy a simple plate of rice as a starch. But then again, I also came to realize in many occasions, some of us do get carried away in preparations, and we can actually forget or tend to forget you can actually enrich your rice by giving it a bit of life and a bit of color with the simplest of ingredients. So as you can be able to see from this plate before us today, it is also a very, very nice, beautiful appearance to a dish. And as I said, some very, very beautiful, cheap and locally available ingredients will of course aid in giving you a nice, beautiful plate of food any given time. So I'm going to just allow that to sit on the side. And now we'll jump into the next process of today. So as I mentioned, we're going to be doing some soy chunks. So these have already been steamed up and they're nice and ready. They're just waiting to join the rest of the mixture a little later. But as we begin the next process, I'll of course begin by heating up a pot. Now, one particular thing with soy chunks, remember, once you've pre-cooked them as we've just done, it is of course very, very simple for you to begin cooking the rest of the ingredients that are still raw. Remember, very important to mention that if you're going to be cooking, very important that you distinguish between raw and cooked ingredients, because this may actually be able to make it much easier for you to finish cooking your process a little faster and of course save time and fuel as well. Now we're going to begin by pounding down some garlic. Now very, very important, always add a bit of salt to your pestle and mortar. Remember, this will aid in grinding your garlic a little faster, saving you quite a bit of time. And also to mention, we have of course begun by adding some oil to our pan. Right, now once your garlic is nicely pounded, proceed to go round the sides of your pestle and mortar and just grind that to a very, very smooth paste. This of course you can do way in advance, but if you can of course be able to do so before your pan is too hot, proceed to do it just as I did. Right, now very important to clean out your pestle. And for those of you who pretty much may not have already purchased such a tool, remember you can of course achieve the same consistency of paste by using even a garlic presser. It will of course save you also the effort of chopping up. But if you may of course not be able to reach any of the two, there are of course many different techniques of mincing. They are of course much longer and much more difficult, but I would recommend this particular kind of a tool will of course be much cheaper and is much more locally available to you. It will of course save you the effort every time. Right, so begin by cleaning out your mortar with a spoon and proceed to add some garlic to your pan. So we're looking at about 1 heaped teaspoon of garlic at this stage. Proceed to move that through the base of your pan. And just as soon as the garlic begins to sizzle, we're going to proceed to add our onions. So we're using 2 medium-sized onions for this recipe. Right, once that's in, very simply proceed to mix through with a spoon. And of course, while sweating out your onions, very important to remember to incorporate the rest of the ingredients. So I'm going to start by adding my cumin powder. I'm also going to add my tomato paste at this stage. Remember, we are looking for a nice heavy consistent stew. I'm also going to add my dried up parsley. So you can of course be able to acquire some local parsley that is of course fresh. One beautiful thing about combining the dried and the fresh parsley, remember they also carry a different content of flavor. So you can of course be able to incorporate the fresh one if you can't of course find the dry one, and vice versa. Right, so as you continue to mix through, cooking at of course very medium to low heat. This will of course give your spices a bit of time to activate, making it of course a nice beautiful process of creating the aromas in your pan. Also remember to press down into the tomato paste, making sure to try and mince that through, or rather get it combined with the onions as you continue. And very much important to also mention at this stage, you will of course incorporate the rest of your carrots. Remember, those take a little longer to cook, so you may actually want to incorporate them a little earlier in the process. Proceed to mix through once more. And of course, as we allow that to continue to cook through, proceed to add just a little bit of water as you continue. And you can now turn your heat to about medium. So remember, one particular thing that happens, especially with spices that are dried, they actually require a bit of time for you to get the flavors right by activating them. And this can only be done by cooking them on a dry pan, as adding liquid will of course dilute the flavors and you may actually not be able to get the full impact of your dried spices. So mix that through. We've of course turned the heat up to medium now from low. So you may actually want to be very, very vigilant with your pan right now. Remember, it could actually, the liquid could evaporate very, very quickly, and you could of course proceed to burn or change the effect of the spices. So for this stage, be very vigilant to stick next to your pan. And just pretty much continue to mix through right up until just all of your liquid is absorbed. And once you have just a little bit in there, very important to also add your stock cube at this stage. Remember, stock cubes are a very, very beautiful alternative from using stock liquid. They also carry a very, very good abundance of flavor, and they'll always give a nice, beautiful aroma to your meal every single time. Another thing to also mention, if you're going to be making a vegetarian dish, be sure to stick with vegetarian stock cubes. Remember, if you're going to be serving this to someone who may not be allowed to consume any animal products, remember beef stock cubes may actually contain some chunks of beef or some beef liquid in them, which was used in the process of making them. So be sure to always be very, very cautious if you're making a very, very strict vegetarian dish. Right, so this should actually start to combine into a very, very pasty consistency. The carrots will of course continue to cook very, very gently as you proceed. I'm going to add just a bit more water, just enough water to of course cover the base of the pan and should actually be able to touch the surface of your mixture. Right, as this continues to cook down, gives you quite a bit of time to continue to chop up your tomatoes. So I'm going to begin by slicing this into half and into quarters. So we're using semi-ripe tomatoes for this recipe. Another good alternative to incorporate to this dish would be some cherry tomatoes. Remember, those are actually nice and sweet. They do carry also very, very, very beautiful flavor to them. But of course, since we're working on a very, very simple and of course cost-effective recipe, using your rawest or using your most natural tomatoes will of course save you quite a bit of cost. Right, so once those are halved and quartered, we're going to now proceed to seed them. I'm just going to slice right between the flesh of the tomato and the skin. And you remember, very important to mention, especially when making stews, remember that the juices and the pulp from the inside of the tomatoes with the seeds is also a very, very good inclusion to your dish. But of course, since we're trying to keep the mixture nice and dry today, we're of course going to try and keep our stew nice and simple. We're going to deseed our tomatoes, of course, and we're going to chop them much finer. Remember, it's also very important that I mention, I will not mention or I will not insist that you throw the seeds away. You can, of course, even throw this into your vegetable garden right outside. This could actually allow for you to grow your own tomatoes. You can, of course, also just blend them and add them to your mixture if you, of course, have no other purpose for using them. But they are, of course, very, very good, especially when making maybe some skin treatments. I have actually seen it in a few places that there's actually a way that you can actually turn it into a face scrub. So do actually check out online. There's very, very many alternatives for what you could be able to do with some trimmings from vegetables. Right, simple as that. Now once that's done, we're going to proceed to chop those up or slice them into some very, very thin strips. And as I mentioned, very important to keep your eye on your pan. Always give it a mix. Remember, one particular thing about cooking with a big pot, you may actually be able to look at the mixture and It may actually look like it's very, very okay, but once you mix, you will realize that the mixture will continue to thicken as you continue. So very, very important to keep your eyes peeled through the process. And of course, it will also aid in ensuring that you don't actually burn your mixture. Right, so as I continue to finish the tomatoes, we're of course going to be incorporating our last few ingredients at this stage. Remember, the soy chunks will have to, of course, get into the mixture before we close off the dish. I'm just going to finish up the tomatoes. We're, of course, also going to be incorporating some coriander seeds. But as I mentioned, it is one of the main ingredients to this recipe that you can, of course, omit. And remember, just using the fresh coriander will, of course, just do as much as the seeds do. So into that, add your coriander seeds. Now, the beauty about coriander seeds, they will actually continue to cook into the mixture. They will, of course, also absorb a bit of liquid, and they will, of course, disappear. So you can, of course, proceed to use them even without crushing. Remember, they're pretty much going to absorb some liquid. They will, of course, cook into the mixture as well. So it's one of the many beautiful raw spices that you can actually be able to purchase that are also very, very much easy to work with. And, of course, very, very beautiful, diverse flavors from them. Right, so to that, we're going to add our chopped up tomatoes. And, of course, proceed to mix that through. Now this will, of course, continue to break down very, very gently into the mixture. So very, very importantly, remember, of course, the carrots will take a little longer. This is the reason why we added them a little earlier. But of course, by the time our tomatoes are almost breaking apart, you should actually be able to have your carrots nice and softened up, which will, of course, call for the addition of the last few ingredients, which is, of course, the green bell pepper, the green pepper chopped, and of course the fresh coriander. Now at this stage, I will, of course, turn your attention back to the soy chunks, and will, of course, also give this pot a cover. Now, one particular thing I like to do with soy chunks before adding them to a stew, very, very important to fry them very, very slightly. It also allows for them to get a nice, beautiful color and flavor. So onto a pan, proceed to add a little bit of oil once more. Now, we're pretty much going to allow our pan to heat up. So I'm just going to move these around just for you to be able to get a nice, clear picture from the cameras. And now remember, as those continue to cook, very important to remember to keep the temperature very, very constant. So I've actually allowed it to continue to cook at medium. But of course, by covering the mixture always allows for you to rush the process a little bit. And now as our pan continues to heat up, we're just going to allow it to get nice and hot, making sure that it can actually smoke very, very quickly. And now bringing your attention back to the soy chunks, I'm just going to lift those from the pot or the pan. And you can be able to see it from the cameras there. They're actually going to swell up nice and beautifully. Remember, adding this before steaming will, of course, make them much tougher. They may actually overcook into the mixture, and you may actually not be able to trace them at the end of the cooking process. So another beautiful suggestion to share with, especially when working with soy chunks, a little bit of frying gives them that bit of texture to be able to hold shape. And of course, when you finally add them into the dish, you can actually be able to pick them out from the rest of your dish. Right, so we're going to proceed to add our soy chunks once our pan is hot. Now, as I had mentioned a little earlier, we had, of course, chopped up some onions for this, but this is, of course, an alternative if you're going to be serving them side by side. But if you're, of course, going to be combining everything into one pot, you can actually just proceed to fry these up and just proceed to add them into the rest of your mixture. Now what you want to do at this stage is give them a nice beautiful browning. So you can of course add a little bit of oil if the mixture is still very, very wet and you're not getting much color through it. So be very, very gentle when frying these up. Remember, they will overcook very, very fast. So one particular pointer to check on, especially when working with this, be sure to make sure not to overcook them during the steaming process, as this could of course change the consistency of them completely. It will of course begin to mash as it hits the hot pan. So be very, very gentle when turning them over as well. Be sure to maybe use a flat lifter that can actually be able to scoop from the bottom and turn them over. And this will of course avoid them from breaking apart. Now a nice beautiful strong aroma from the soy. Remember, this is an extract of some beans, and you will actually be able to get that smell coming through, especially once the pan gets nice and hot. And of course at this stage, as you cook as well, be sure to give them a toss consistently, as this will of course stick to the pan much faster even with the second addition of oil. So continue to toss those over, and once they're nicely golden brown in color, and your pan should of course be very, very dry at the base, we're going to proceed to turn the heat off completely. And I'll now take you back to the pot that we began with. So I'm just going to open that at this stage. We're now going to begin to add the rest of the ingredients. So remember, the green bell pepper will of course cook very, very fast. So I'm just going to add those at this stage. And you can use the same spoon you had with the soy. Proceed to mix that through. And once your peppers are mixed in, proceed to also mix in your soy chunks. Remember, very important to make sure your carrots are also nice and soft by the time the soy chunks go in there. Just of course to make sure that you don't actually overcook your mixture. I'm just going to proceed to mix that through. And I'm actually also going to just move it to this other side, just for you to be able to get a nice clear picture. Right, so this should of course take you anywhere between 5 to 6 minutes. Of course, right from the point where your soy chunks and your bell peppers go into the mixture. Remember, you do also want some nice beautiful crunchy peppers into this mixture. But of course, as you work towards your very end, we're now going to finish off by adding our chopped coriander. So for this, I'm just going to begin by slicing off the root end. Remember, the stalks are they're particularly hard to get into a very consistent smaller size. So I'm of course going to just use the leaf side. I'm going to discard the stalks. But as I said, this is of course a very good alternative to be able to make some stock with. So I'm just going to grab that and I'm going to add that to the tomatoes that we had a little earlier. And as I said, especially when working with vegetables, remember, nothing goes to waste. You can always be able to reuse any particular ingredients, even those that you trim away. And once that's done, a very rough, quick chop of your fresh coriander leaves. I'm just going to save a small handful for garnish, and I'll proceed to add the rest. Of course, making sure not to add any of the stalks at this stage. Remember, those will of course not cook as fast, so be sure to not add them at this stage. And all you need to do now is toss the mixture. Of course, once more, making sure to toss from the bottom, lifting the mixture up. And this will of course make sure that you don't actually proceed to cook and mash your soy chunks. So nice beautiful aroma coming through. Very importantly, before you forget, remember to season. I'm going to crush in some black peppercorns. And we're also going to give a nice beautiful drizzle of some salt. Right, now give that about 2 or 3 more mixes. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is as easy as it gets. Now this is already done, so I'm just going to proceed to turn that off completely, and we're going to proceed to plating. Now remember, as I mentioned a little earlier in the show, very important that I remind you at this stage, this is a very good alternative for those of you who are of course looking at a beautiful diet alternative to eating meat, of course for protein substitutes. But remember, you can of course be able to get the same amount of protein supplements from this dish as you would from beans or even meat. So this of course for you gives you a nice new alternative to work with, especially if you're looking at some different new alternatives to try out for yourself and maybe even for your family. Now I'm just going to proceed to serve that onto a plate. So onto a nice big plate, I'm going to give about 2 or 3 scoops. Of course, always making sure to toss the mixture in the liquid beneath it, just to make sure that your mixture is not dry. And I'm going to scoop that onto a plate for you to see. And as I said, very important to also remind you at this stage, always try and make sure that you don't actually overcook your vegetables. Remember, vegetables are preferably had almost half cooked. Remember, this is the only way to make sure that you retain most of the nutrients, and it also allows for you to get the freshest and most beautiful consistency out of them. So be sure to of course not cook this to a mushy consistency. As I said once more, it will of course give you a very, very different outcome at the end of the dish. Right, so I'm just going to finish the dish off by giving it a nice beautiful garnish over the rice. So some fresh coriander leaves over the top. And remember, by tossing the rice a little later, you will of course be able to get the beautiful essence of the coriander leaves. And of course, last but not least, a bit of some chili flakes right over the top. And that should give it a nice beautiful kick of heat, which of course brings us to the last and final part of the show. So I will of course take this opportunity to thank you once more for tuning in and joining us on Dinner Guide today. I will of course remind you as well, if you do have any questions, queries, or even compliments or suggestions, do feel free to write back to us through our Facebook page. That's BrandPlus TV Kenya. And of course, if you've missed out on this and any other different recipes that we've covered on the show in the past, remember you can be able to catch up on that and more through our YouTube channel. That's BrandPlus TV Kenya as well. So I will of course take this opportunity to wish you a beautiful evening. For those of you tuned in, thank you once again. I will of course also remind you to keep trying some of the dishes we try on the show. Do feel free to write back to us and give us your feedback. Just give us an idea of what you experience in your own home kitchens. Maybe we can of course be able to help out where we can. But for now, I will bid you farewell. God's blessings, and until the next episode, do have a lovely evening and see you soon.